Nobody told us the HOA patrol was coming back that day, and even if they had, I still wouldn't have believed a bunch of grown men would ride dirt bikes straight through my grandma's memorial garden like they were storming enemy territory. But that's exactly what happened. One second the marigolds were glowing in the morning sun, the next they were exploding into orange confetti under spinning tires. And my grandpa, who could live through a tornado without raising his voice, set down his sweet tea, stared at those crushed flowers, and got that tiny twitch in his left eye that meant somebody had just made a historic mistake. That morning had started peaceful. Birds in the pecan trees, the rooster butchering his crow from the fence post, damp soil warming under the sun. Grandpa and I had been in the garden since dawn. That patch of land wasn't just where we grew food. It was where Grandma still lived in a way. After she passed, Grandpa planted her favorite flowers all around the edges, marigolds, snapdragons, forget-me-nots, because he said flowers were more honest than stone. So when those bikes came ripping in from the trail behind the apple trees, they didn't just flatten vegetables, they tore through something sacred. The riders wore matching jackets with HOA patrol stitched on the back. They cut across the watermelon patch, scattered the chickens, and looped right through Grandma's flowers before shooting back toward the fence. Karen Dunstable showed up 10 minutes later in Pearl's white sneakers and a smile that made me want to bury the clipboard she was carrying. She barely looked at the damage. Said the patrol had been conducting an essential trail inspection for a new HOA recreation corridor. I reminded her our property hadn't even been part of the HOA since the boundary correction years earlier. She waved me off. Then she handed Grandpa a violation notice. Not for trespassing, not for property damage. For our decorative rock border, apparently an unauthorized natural obstruction to patrol access. She said if we interfered again, the HOA legal team would get involved. Grandpa folded the paper, once slid it into his pocket, and said absolutely nothing. Karen took that silence for weakness. That night, Grandpa dragged out an old dented military trunk I'd never seen before. Inside were notebooks, survey flags, pliers, weatherproof signs, and enough odd hardware to make me wonder what exactly he'd done before retiring into tomatoes and silence. He flipped through one battered notebook, looked at me over his glasses, and said, real calm, "They want a trail? Fine, we'll give them one." Grandpa wasn't trying to hurt anybody. He wanted to stop fools, embarrass bullies, and protect what was his. So for the next 2 nights we worked, we posted clearer signs, reset the trail cams, marked the real property line, rerouted sprinklers, and Grandpa built a fake authorized route that led trespassers away from the garden and straight into slick mud, wet mulch, and small-town humiliation. By sunrise on the 3rd day, everything was ready. We sat on the porch, Grandpa with his tea, me watching the trail cam feed from the barn. He raised his glass toward the flowers and said, "For your grandma." Around 10, the engines came back. Same 2 riders, same swagger. And hiding behind the brush near the trail entrance was Karen herself, filming with her phone. The first rider followed our little inspection route, hit the soaked patch by the chicken run, and went down hard in the mud. The second tried to cut around him, caught the edge of the mulch trench, and sank into compost. Karen came rushing in, yelling, before she even reached them, stepped exactly where she shouldn't have, and landed hands first in a pile of burst tomatoes Grandpa had left in her path. Of course she called the sheriff. Sheriff Connie Rayburn rolled up that afternoon with the face of a woman who had seen every possible kind of neighborhood stupidity. Karen launched into a whole speech about sabotage danger, emotional distress, and interference with community trail operations. Connie let her talk, then turned to Grandpa. Grandpa handed her printed stills from the trail cams, time-stamped photos, clear boundary markers, dirt bikes tearing through our garden 2 days earlier. Connie looked at Karen, then at the crushed flowers, and said, "Looks to me like your patrol trespassed on private land, damaged a garden, and then came back for seconds." Karen tried to blame Grandpa's deterrence. Connie cut that off fast. "This isn't a public trail, Karen. It's a backyard." That should have ended it. Instead, Karen doubled down. 2 days later, a certified notice showed up claiming the HOA was seizing a strip through our yard for an emergency green corridor expansion. That was Karen's favorite move. When reality didn't obey her, she printed a version that did. Grandpa read the papers once, tucked them under the short leg of his rocking chair to stop the wobble, and said, "Whenever bluffers start using bigger fonts, it means they're nervous." Then he climbed into the attic and came back with old surveys, deeds, and county records. He spread them across the kitchen table and tapped one yellowed page. "There's the real line," he said. "The one she's praying nobody checks." That was when the twist hit. Grandpa called Landon Karen's son. I barely remembered him. Just a quiet kid who used to mow lawns before he left town. He showed up the next afternoon in a beat-up pickup with a laptop, a banker's box full of files, and the look of a man who was done protecting family just because it was family. At our kitchen table, he opened scanned HOA minutes, digital maps, financial records, and meeting audio Karen had been careless enough to leave behind. The so-called trail expansion had never been properly approved. The board vote had been manipulated. HOA money had gone to bikes, drone equipment, matching jackets, and landscaping payments tied to Karen's own relatives. Grandpa leaned back slow and said, "Well now, that ain't community planning. That's fraud in pearls." Landon helped us contact the county and flag the false filings. She came storming back onto our land the next day with 2 fresh patrol boys behind her and a plastic sign that read, HOA Development Zone, no unauthorized entry. Then she marched straight into Grandma's garden and stabbed it into the soil like she was planting a flag on conquered land. Grandpa walked over, pulled the sign back out, handed it to me, and said nothing. Karen turned, saw Landon standing on the porch, and for the first time since this started, she looked shocked instead of smug. "You think this is over because you got my son involved," she snapped. Landon stepped down off the porch, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "No. It's over because you lied to your neighbors, stole from the HOA, and finally ran into people who kept records." Karen opened her mouth, but before she could spit out another threat, Sergeant Beak, our meanest hen, flew out from under the porch and pecked her right on the ankle. Karen yelped, stumbled backward, and sat down hard in the compost row. The next morning, Sheriff Connie came back with a county investigator. They reviewed the deeds, the fake maps, the financial records, the meeting audio, all of it. By sunset, Karen had been served citations for trespassing property damage and unauthorized surveillance, and the county had opened a formal investigation into the HOA filings. But Karen still had one last tantrum in her. 3 days later, right at dawn, 7 riders came rumbling toward our property in matching vests. Karen sat in her SUV, behind them sunglasses on, trying to look like a commander. Grandpa stood by the fence in his old flannel thermos in one hand, calm as church. The riders followed the fake markers we'd left in place. One plunged into a washout near the apple trees. One slid sideways by the feed buckets and went straight into a manure cart. Another got turned around by a gate rigged to swing shut and stop bikes cold. Sprinklers kicked on. Chickens screamed. Grown men cursed. One stumbled out of the side yard so drenched in purple wood stain he looked like a bruised grape with regrets. Then Sheriff Connie arrived. She took one look at Karen's little army dragging bikes out of mud and ditches and pulled a final county order from her cruiser. Private land, no easement, no corridor, no HOA claim, done. Karen snatched the paper, tore it in half, and that finished her. Landon handed the deputy a USB drive containing the forged minutes, the expense trail, and the emails tying the whole thing together. Connie told Karen she was now under formal investigation and ought to start thinking less about trails and more about lawyers. Nobody argued after that. The riders loaded up and left. That evening, the porch felt different. Fireflies blinked over Grandma's flowers. The air smelled like wet soil, tomato vines, and justice. Landon said he was running for HOA president not out of revenge, but because somebody had to clean up the mess. Grandpa gave him a jar of pickles and a silent nod. By the end of the week, the county ruled fully in our favor. The HOA had to abandon the trail plan, remove the signs, and issue written apologies to the homeowners Karen had bullied. Landon won the next election in a landslide. The patrol unit got dissolved. The maps got redrawn using actual property lines instead of Karen's fantasy version. And the garden bloomed again. Neighbors started showing up with pies, tools, and stories they'd been too scared to tell before. That was the part that stuck with me. Bullies don't stay powerful because they're strong. They stay powerful because everybody else gets tired, quiet, or scared. Karen didn't fall because somebody screamed louder than she did. She fell because Grandpa stayed calm, kept the evidence, and refused to hand over peace just because she showed up with paperwork and a louder engine. That was the lesson. Hiding underneath all the noise, some people mistake control for authority and fear for respect. But land memory and dignity don't belong to whoever acts the loudest. Sometimes justice looks simple. A line held, a lie exposed, a garden still standing. Now when the wind moves through the garden at sundown, it sounds like peace earned the hard way. Grandma's flowers are blooming again. The chickens strut like they own the county. Grandpa rocks on the porch like nothing ever happened. So tell me this, when somebody abuses a little power and keeps pushing until they step all over your peace, where's the line between justice and revenge? And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a bully, or somebody who thought the rules only applied to other people, drop your story in the comments. I want to know what you would have done.